Okay, in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about aggregate supply, in particular the short run aggregate supply curve. But to do that, we have to start with long run aggregate supply. And so this here is our long run aggregate supply curve. In blue here is the short run aggregate supply curve. And you'll notice, of course, that the long run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line. That means that the price level has no effect on this long run aggregate supply. Price level can be low, way down here. Aggregate supply will just be whatever it is. Price level can be high, say way up here. Long run aggregate supply, again, it's just going to be whatever it is. It's not going to change because the price level has changed. And the reason that is because long run aggregate supply is just potential GDP. Okay, so let's look at the definition of potential GDP quickly. So here I am at the top of the aggregate supply page. So potential GDP, the amount of real GDP, that is output, an economy can produce by fully employing its existing levels of labor, physical capital, and technology in the context of its existing market and legal institutions. Okay, so that's just to say that an economy, that is a society, is using everything it has, workers, factories, knowledge, to make goods and services, but without breaking the law, destroying the environment. It's not using child labor. It's doing everything above board, but it's using its full capacity to do so. Okay, so long run aggregate supply is just what the economy can do, however much real GDP it can produce. Okay, now short run aggregate supply is different, and what I want to talk about here is why short run aggregate supply has that is the curve, has this particular shape that it does. So you'll see that down here on the far left, it's not very steep at all, almost flat. Up here on the far right, it is very steep, almost vertical, and then in the middle, it's just in between. Okay, so the reason for this has to do with how far short-run aggregate supply is from long-run aggregate supply, that is potential GDP. So if we are, say, over here, short-run aggregate supply is at this point here, then it is very far from potential GDP, which is to say that there's a lot of capacity in the economy, a lot of factories, a lot of workers that aren't being used. Okay, and again, that's when we're at this point, way over here, far, far away from long-run aggregate supply. Okay, now let's think about what will happen if there is an increase to the price level from, well, 90. So the price level where we would be if we were at this point on the short-run aggregate supply curve. So if the price level increases by, well, we'll go 5 points. So from 90 to 95, because there is so much unused capacity, so many workers who aren't working, so many factories that aren't being used, a small increase in the price level is going to have a huge effect on output, that is on GDP. So you just get this little bump in the price level, and suddenly everyone starts going crazy and producing more stuff. Okay, so, well, about there. All right, so consequently, because a small increase to the price level, or 5 points anyway, has this large increase in GDP, That's why the curve is pretty flat way over here on the far left. All right, now next, let's think about if short-run aggregate supply is, say, right here. So here we are actually a little bit above potential GDP. We're not breaking the law, we're not destroying the environment, we're not using child labor, but a lot of workers, say, are going to be working overtime. Factories are adding extra shifts. Maybe there's some people who don't really have the skills or the ideal skill set for some particular job, but they're still being put to work, those kinds of things. So that gets us a little bit above potential GDP. So at this point here, we're using all available capacity. Workers can work overtime if they want, and that's what's getting us, let's say, a little bit above potential GDP. All right, now if we are at this point, then the price level is at 115. So again, let's say that we go up by 5 points. Now in this case, because we're already above potential GDP, the price level can increase by the same amount that we were talking about before, or at least the same 5 points. We should be looking at percent changes, but this is fine for now. Price level goes up by 5 points. Now there just isn't going to be that much ability for output, that is GDP, to increase. There's just nowhere for it to go, so to speak. It will increase by a little bit, but not by much. Okay, so that's why we have this steep slope here. An increase over here, 5 points, is only going to cause this tiny little increase in output. And so we have a steep slope for our curve. Now, if we are, let's say, here in our middle portion, then we have some unused capacity, but we're not too far from long-run aggregate supply, that is, from potential GDP. Okay, so if we're at this point here, then our price level is 100. Again, we'll go up by 5 points to 105. And so in this case, well, let's get in here first. So in this case, GDP is just going to increase by some amount that's intermediate between what we saw over here and over here. GDP will increase, but it will be by a more moderate amount. Okay, so that will put us there. And so that's why the curve in this middle portion is more moderate than what we see on the far left and the far right. A 5-point increase to the price level increases GDP by an intermediate amount. Some, not too little, not too much, or not a lot. Okay.